full consciousness, and the karmic work of the soul and the spirit. So who reaches the LOC full consciousness? Reaching full consciousness is working on the ego self, the separate self. It is working on the ego identity, on the misidentification of who you really are. So as one rises upwards and upwards, opening greater consciousness, the separate self, as Aurobindo called it, the psychic being, but generally it's known as the ego self, separate self. This is the one who dissolves. Or in other words, you open up a greater capacity to be beyond the separate self. Thus, it becomes more and more obvious that you are the self, if we use the traditional jnana terminology. What happens is that your attention overcomes the entanglements of major conditionings, which prevent you from experiencing the larger self, the bigger self. Once these largest entanglements are dissolved, or some of the major conditioning is dissolved, then you open up more and more and you familiarize with what is the sahaja self, the natural self, which we call full consciousness. How does that relate to the soul, spirit, karma clearing? The soul itself simply has an experience of dissolving the ego self. Ego self is not a real thing. It is a certain misplaced identity. So the soul experiences that it is dissolving this mask of identity that was put on. And opening up to higher levels of consciousness, the soul itself experiences gaining access to these higher states of consciousness. But it doesn't mean that the soul becomes fully liberated by realizing awareness or the self as such. That is not the case, because if it would be that simple, then everybody who opens up to full consciousness, self, would be already fully liberated beings, and basically all spiritual teachers that we ever known on the planet Earth would be fully liberated souls. In terms of advancement, they would be at 10,000 of advancement or above, which is not the case. On a numerical scale, we know that opening to full consciousness is 1,000, while complete soul liberation is 10,000. So it means that there is much more work to do for the soul to clear the karma, to turn every pebble and clean it all up, to do a great sweep. It's not always related to conditioning. Maybe it was a reason for certain conditioning, but the whole humanity is conditioned. This is a standard procedure of indoctrination and societal conditioning here on Earth, but it doesn't mean that it's all karmic. So karma is not equal to conditioning. Karma doesn't mean the ego self-identity either, because everyone born on earth has the ego self-identity and they have to work with it. So it's not something individual as an individual karma. Everybody comes in this world the same way. This is how it's imprinted in the human energy system. Upon entering this earth, you get a physical form, you get the ego self, and everybody has the same start, we may say. So, full consciousness is a highway of opening these greater degrees of consciousness, overcoming that misidentification, that limited separate self identity itself. As I usually say, is that we work through only that which blocks opening up these higher states of consciousness, but truly blocks it. We don't heal everything on the way. We don't resolve all the karmas on the way, because otherwise nobody would reach full consciousness. It would be way too difficult, way too long. And we found an easier way, and any other gurus also found that it's much easier to attain certain self-realization. That, we may say, is quite an easier task. And clearing karma, this is where many gurus do not work with that, interestingly. So they might have some idea, but many don't work with that. And those who do work, they usually become limited by their particular lineage. I will repeat, they are usually limited by their own particular lineage. So that is why it is very rare to find someone who takes an integral approach, or to wait for someone special who comes to this world and who opens up in some ways into these higher advancements. For example, Sai Baba of Shirdi, or Meher Baba and other great beings. Although when you look at their life biography, their life story, it wasn't easy at all. And they have really worked on a great deal of purifications. Yet still, austerities and purifications do not mean that you will resolve all the karma. Because if we look at the Jainism, one of the major world religions, they have adopted some of the most severe austerities for karmic purifications. However, they are only at the Pinda level primarily, a little bit of Anda, and very little bit of Brahmanda. Even interestingly more so, Jainism doesn't believe in grace, which basically made it extremely limited path. I don't know what happened there in the history, but something went very wrong, and they have limited their own potential as a tradition religion. Buddhism didn't do that, Hinduism didn't do that, and Sikhism neither. Thus, they can progress much further along the spiritual path. So, opening to full consciousness is gaining access, like getting granted a visa, experiencing that this is possible. And mainly, it is about resolving that inbuilt error in the human system of a separate self identity. Now, of course, looking at different traditions where gurus announce that I am the self and there's nothing else. And when they start to speak of the absolutes in all regards, they adopt a specific language, basically, which is called Jnana Yoga language or Advaita Vedanta language. And it's simplistic and exaggerated in many ways. But when we look at their soul advancement, we see that there is much more work to do, usually, to actually become liberated. Therefore, the common understanding of ending the cycle of rebirth is a very limited understanding, because it can simply mean that you will end the cycle of rebirth here on Earth. Well, there are many billions of other planets and galaxies where you can venture next and incarnate as something else. It is known in the higher traditions, such as Sikhism and Jainism as well. They haven't correlated that to Buddhism yet, but it is generally known that a soul transmigrates over 8.4 million life forms. 8.4. So the problem with these, again, simplified terms that ending the cycle of rebirth is salvation and that's it, we need to question, what does that truly mean? Ending the cycle of rebirth where? And as we know, you can end the cycle of rebirth on this planet, which brings us to the Ascension teachings. So in the Ascension teachings, that degree of initiation means level of consciousness 500, and the ending of cycle of rebirth means on Earth in particular. Now, there are other Ascension schools which have different systems, and their meaning of initiation is different. There are many Ascension schools. Just like saying yoga, what does yoga mean? Does it mean going to a gym and doing a fitness style yoga? Or do you mean mantra yoga? Or do you mean Kriya yoga? Or do you mean karma yoga? Or what type of yoga do you mean? So the same term ascension or ascension teachings have, with the same analogy of yoga, many different systems, and they mean different things. So I want you to understand that many times concepts like ending cycle of rebirth is like saying I'm practicing yoga or I'm studying ascension teachings. And the meaning behind it can be vastly different. Yeah, so we need to look deeper. What exactly is the deeper meaning of these topics? Coming to full consciousness is very important in our tradition because it gives you the biggest results or changes in your life fastest, we may say. Let's consider another scenario. If you start off with karma clearing work, this is a very long path. It's a very dedicated practice. And if you haven't went on the consciousness opening path first, you will struggle a lot along the way because you will lack space. You will lack these higher fields of consciousness. They're not open in you. You have no capacity to access them or enter them, and you just keep working on your karma, you will bump into many ceilings, into many obstacles. So that will be much difficult way to do it so. And therefore, starting off with opening to higher levels of consciousness is much more beneficial and effective because you increase your capacity to experience these higher states of consciousness, to have space for all the energies that you're cleaning and clearing and purifying. You open up the space and the larger fields of light for all of your forms of consciousness. Once you come to, let's say, awareness, level of consciousness, or even more importantly, so the divine, you already have plentiful of space for each of your forms of consciousness. And even more so when you reach the LOC 850 or divine love state of consciousness, you have direct access to the divine in our tradition, because other, again, paths and traditions, they do not focus on that, or they don't reach that. So it is highly valuable, first of all, to have capacity, space, and access, and then do the more difficult part of deep scrubbing and deep clearing. As you open up to these high levels of consciousness, you will already overcome certain major obstacles. You will already learn some major healing techniques and the ways to already support yourself. So you are becoming a spiritual adult, and now doing the clearing of karma work is so much better and easier and self-responsible than that it becomes very beautiful and effective to continue to do this more difficult task. Okay, we have a few questions. Do the Akashic records contain information about karma? Yes. Is it helpful working with Akashic records? Akashic records it's simply a database. That's what it is. What is there to work with Akashic records? It's like a file cabinet where things are recorded. That's what it is. So some people who are more psychic, they can access the Akashic records and read only what they are resonating with. It's the same thing, like there is an elephant and 10 people look at it, and let's say 5 of them are half blinded, and they will see a different thing. One will hug the leg of elephant and say, this is a column. Another one will touch the tail of elephant and will say, this is a rope. Another one will touch the hair of elephant and it will say it's a flap. This is how psychics read Akashic records. They rarely ever get the whole picture. So no, we don't work with Akashic records as such. In this analogy that I gave you, it gives you a better idea of how many misunderstandings there can be in the Akashic records. And of course, on the path, you may gain ability to receive information and so on, but Akashic records are a file store cabinet there is in Anda, and there is in Brahmanda, and there is in Parbrahmanda. It's just a system of storage of information at different regions of divine cosmology. But the truest living information is the light divine, is the alive source, which is the living light, a living information, which shines forth, and it can be decoded according to your receptivity, according to your ability to decode that, to make sense out of it, of what is this. You receive a great light, but it's like a fiber optic cable. If a child finds a fiber optic cable, they will play it like rope. If a student engineer finds a fiber optic cable, they will understand better that it carries information and data. And if you have the right equipment via the fiber optic cable, you will be able to decode whatever data it carries, videos, pictures, audio, and all of it. So the light divine is the true light of all knowledge, all energy, all information, all bliss. And you are the receiver of that. You are the receiver. Then it depends how you decode it, interpret it, what you do with it. Akashic records are more stale. They're just storage of records, which there is a constant recording happening. So they're not the living light of God itself. There was one more question about activating of root chakra and working with the spirit and the mantras of the spirit is also very powerful, because when a teacher is transmitting the light into the spirit, it is basically like your spirit receiving a transmission and the spirit is activating. And therefore, it has activated your spirit at the root chakra, and it's quite common. The spirit is what we have found is a very neglected part of all spiritual practitioners. It is more developed in the Bhakti Yoga tradition. In the Jnana Yoga, it's completely dried out. So those who are more in Bhakti tradition, and more particularly who do work with the Shabd, the divine light sound stream, there's a particular yoga lineage called Nada Yoga. Only those beings basically work with the spirit to a certain extent and certain capacity. So more bhakti-oriented traditions work on that. But then, they lack inquiry side. So then they lack the more clear stages of realization, typically. So what we have found is that the spirit is usually underdeveloped, and it is one of the major pillars of your being. And thus, for liberation work, it is highly important. So you may experience these sensations like root chakra and all other type of sensations when the spirit activates.